All right, so welcome to our October 2021 Board Education Training, and we're going to feature reserve studies and capital planning this evening. Just to go over as well, our next board roundtable will be held on Monday, November 8th, and that's going to be featuring Dash and Love Insurance. They're going to go over the general insurance process for community associations. And then we will also be hosting another roundtable on Monday, December 6th, featuring O&S Engineering on capital reserve studies as well. So that will be an opportunity if you want to learn more about reserve studies from an actual engineering firm and ask them specific questions. Please join us again on December 6th. All right, so also this evening we have Lauren Kissel, who is a director with CAMCO, and we have Irina Alexowski, who is our director of financial reporting, and they're going to go into some board meeting basics and our budgeting process. All right, so I will get us started with reserve studies and capital planning. Here we go. All right, so what is a reserve study? So a reserve study is an in-depth evaluation of a property's physical components and an analysis of the cost and time frame for anticipated replacements or major repairs to the common area elements. So typically, when you're getting a reserve study, you're going to hire an independent engineering firm to conduct this analysis and to prepare for capital replacement projects and funding. So some associations will utilize firms that they've used in the past, or if you haven't used one in the past, or you're looking for a different firm, our CAMCO managers can definitely help to provide you details on pricing and frequently used firms throughout some of our other associations. Typically, the reserve study is going to have projections on funding and expenditures for 30 years. So it's going to show you a very vast overview of your what your association needs. However, updates should typically be done every 5 years, and we'll get more into detail towards the end of my presentation on that. So how much is enough? So we get asked this question so many times from board members, and they just want to know, well, how much should we have in our reserves and how much should we fund to it? Well, the answer comes from the reserve study itself. So each association has different funding needs based on what common area components they have and prior saving or spending trends. So where $100,000 might be a lot for one association to have in their reserves, it might be severely underfunded for another association to have in their reserves. So there's not one specific amount or number or magic sort of 3 times your expenditures amount that we can give for your reserve, because again, it depends on past spending patterns, past funding patterns, etc. So that's where the reserve studies really come into play. So we're going to go over the different parts of the reserve study. There's the physical analysis and then the financial analysis. So the physical analysis is going to have an inventory of all of your major common area components. It's going to have an assessment of each component's current condition and remaining useful life. It's going to have a description of how the assessment was conducted. It's going to have cost estimates for each component's repair or replacement. And it's going to also cite the sources used to obtain the cost estimates. So typically the engineering firm is going to do a site visit to the property, and that's where they're going to do a visual inspection of the components. So a common misconception that we hear sometimes is, people think that they're doing an in-depth analysis of the remaining useful life or the conditions of the actual components, where they're typically there for 2 to 3 hours. They will take lots of photos, but it is ultimately just a visual inspection. They will also go by what the manager and the board supplies them in terms of when certain elements were last replaced. The more information that you're able to provide them, obviously, the better the report is. And just keep in mind that the reserve study is a guideline. So it's a guideline on when you should replace it. It's a guideline on how much you should fund or save for that expenditure. But, it's not 100% exact in any way. Typically, it's just an overall guideline. So here are some examples of common area components. So you typically have, depending on the association, asphalt or parking lots, concrete, which could be walkways, stairs, etc. Your lighting, which could be your street lighting, your hallway lighting, pools, playgrounds, sports courts, roofs, siding, carpeting, wallpaper, flooring, lobby and hallway furniture, mechanical systems such as your HVAC system, your boilers, etc., and doors. So these are just some examples. And obviously every association is different in terms of what guidelines your association has in terms of what is part of the common area and what is individual homeowner responsibility. The financial analysis. So this is going to be a summary of the reserve amounts needed for the projected expenses. So how much total do you need based on all of the cumulative costs from those expenses? An evaluation of your current funding and reserve balance. So they're always going to ask what you're currently adding to the reserve each year and what your current total reserve replacement fund is at. And then it's going to have your recommended annual funding plan to offset the expenses and a description of the methods used to compute the funding status. So the summary of the reserve amount will also include the projected years in which the expense will occur. Typically, it depends on, again, how your association is funding. We've seen reserve studies that say keep your reserve funding at the level you're currently funding. We have seen others with recommended options for funding where it will be either, an increased percentage each year, or that you should just increase it all at 1 year and then keep that increased number each year. So it depends on, again, the firm that you use, the report, and where they see the funding level necessary to be. So here are some of the benefits of a reserve study. So number one is the board fiduciary duty compliance. So basically for the board's fiduciary duty, you're basically ensuring that you are funding your reserves properly and you're reviewing your replacement projects when necessary. So that's one. It's just making sure that you as a board are, reviewing the necessary items for replacement, making sure that your reserve funding is adequate and that you're not underfunding. Number two, it's a good communication tool, not only for the board members and for the manager to have, but it's also a good communication tool to your residents or your owners. So basically, if owners are wondering, why do we have reserves so high? Why do we require an increase this year? Why do we need a special assessment for this project? You can basically point to that reserve study. You can post it on your, have it posted on the owner's portal if you want, for owners to be able to review it. And it is a good method to show the owners exactly where these numbers came from. And it's not just the board arbitrarily coming up with them. And then number three, it's most beneficial to prioritize your capital projects and your preventative maintenance for those capital projects. And we'll go more into detail on the next slide on that. So your capital planning. So your reserve study can help you to decipher which projects should be reviewed and in what order. You can obtain proposals for definitive costs on upcoming projects. But obviously you want to get engineers or architects involved where applicable for certain large scale projects. So for instance, if your community needs, all new roofs, you will probably want to get an engineer involved to help you come up with the specs for that and to get proposals. But that's kind of where you'll get those solid numbers from for your reserve study to make sure that you're kind of in line with the exact funding levels there. And then just remember that the remaining useful life in the reserve study is an estimate, and we kind of went over this before. The components can last longer or they may need replacement before, but it's just a tool to kind of get the discussion started. Sometimes reserve studies can even shed light onto projects that maybe the board and the manager did not plan for. They didn't think about. It's a project that was just not on anybody's radar, but now, you see in that reserve study, this is something we need to look into more detail on and, get pricing and start to plan that out as well. And again, the financial analysis portion of the reserve study provides an estimate on replacement costs, but you will not be 100% certain until you obtain those actual proposals. All right, and then here are some tips, and we kind of went over this in the first slide as well, but it's update your reserve study every 3 to 5 years. So at the beginning, we said 5 years. I say 3 years if you are a community that is completing a lot of those capital reserve projects within a short period of time. You get a lot of them done. You might want to consider updating your reserve study after 3 years because your funding is going to change. Obviously, some of those expenditures are going to be taken off of there. But generally, as a rule of thumb, we say minimally you should update them every 5 years. Number 2, and this is an important one that I've learned personally, but I think it's really important that the manager and or a board member or board members accompany the reserve specialist or engineer for their site visit to the property. The reason being that we and your properties better than this, third-party person who's just coming in to do a quick 2 or 3 hour site visit, right? So the nooks and crannies of the association where they don't, and they can miss things. So I think it's really important to bring them through, make sure that they can see everything that you're showing them. You probably have some locked doors somewhere, depending on the association. Let them see those areas as well. And also you can go over certain projects that were recently completed, certain projects that you might have in the pipeline to get completed in the near future too. And then number 3, you definitely want to review the drafted study prior to finalizing. So typically all of these engineering firms are going to provide a draft of the reserve study first. And basically we recommend a thorough review of that. Number 1, a thorough review for the components that are listed there. We have had, a communication breakdown sometimes with some reserve studies where unfortunately there are components listed in there that might not be the association's onus to pay for, such as decks. So we've had reserve studies where decks were included within that reserve study, but actually it's the homeowner's responsibility to pay for the decks to be replaced. So it technically shouldn't really be in the reserve study. So it's really important for the components, and then also just to see where they project those, the remaining useful life and when the expenditures should happen. For instance, we recently had a reserve study done where we had the paving reviewed by a couple of different paving contractors, and they said that certain courts did not feel that they should have to be replaced within the next 5 years, but it was put within the next year or so. So that's something where you can work with that reserve study specialist or engineer to update when those expenditures happen. And it's, typically they're very easy to work with, and we'll adjust it upon request if it's within reason. So those are some helpful tips. Hopefully you got some beneficial information from that. I am going to turn it over to Lauren to go into board meeting basics, and then we'll have some time towards the end for questions or discussion.
Thank you, Julia. As Julia mentioned earlier, my name is Lauren Kissel. I'm a director with CAMCO Management, and I'm just going to review some board meeting basics. So first is the structure of a board meeting. Some associations have what are called open meetings. This means that the meeting is open for homeowners to attend. They typically stick around for a majority of the meeting. They may bring items to the board's attention at the beginning of the meeting. And other boards have what are called closed meetings, which essentially means that it's just the board and management meeting and going over the monthly report. If an association has an open meeting, typically the board is going to go into what is called executive session, and the homeowners are dismissed, mainly because the executive session is where sensitive items and confidential items are discussed, which we'll talk a little bit about more what's included in executive session later. So the agenda and the meeting format. So every association is different and every board's different, but there usually are the similar elements to each agenda. So typically what you see first on your agenda are action items. So that would be approvals or affirmations. So approvals of meeting minutes from the last meeting. Perhaps a proposal was approved via email or by some other means in between. So you would just do an affirmation of that approval for the meeting minutes. There's also typically a section for informational items. So this is really just more of a management report, if you will, of maybe some of the maintenance that's happened, some of the administrative items, just kind of a recap of what has happened since the last board meeting. You then have typically old business, which is items that were discussed at previous meetings that may need some action and more discussion. You then have new business, which is exactly what it sounds. There are new topics to be discussed among the board and management. And then finally, you break into executive session. This is where typically delinquencies, violations, any legal matters are discussed, things that have confidentiality that aren't really they're for the board ears only and not the entire general population of the association. So a few quick tips for successful board meetings. They really should be 45 to 2 hours in length. When you start to get beyond that 2 hours, the fatigue sets in, people lose focus, and really the productivity takes a sharp decline. So it's really important to be mindful of the time when holding your board meetings. For those who tend to have difficulties either staying on agenda or completing meetings within the 2 hours, something that we suggest are timed agendas, just making sure that each section of the meeting is given adequate time. And if that time runs out, you move on to the next section of the agenda, and that can remain for further discussion at the next board meeting. It's really important as board members to try and review the materials before the meeting. That way you're familiar with what's going to be discussed, what needs to be approved, and so you can come prepared to ask the questions rather than just reviewing everything for the first time at that meeting. As part of that, if you are reviewing your management report and notice some revisions or there's something that you'd like added to the agenda, send that over to the manager prior. It really helps with the productivity and the flow of the meeting if all of those changes are made prior. And finally, following the order of the agenda is really important. It keeps the meeting on track and organized, especially for the secretary who's taking the minutes. And for the most part, the items on the agenda are put in a certain order for a reason. So next are meeting minutes. So they are essentially a legal record of the association and provide a historic log for the association of what was discussed and for future reference. A lot of times the CPA firm that does your independent financial audit will request the meeting minutes as part of their annual audit. The meeting minutes allow homeowners to stay informed of the board actions, especially for those who do not have open meetings, or if homeowners are unable to attend for any reason. It keeps the association up to date on what the board is doing and sort of the business at hand. Typically, the secretary is the person who takes the meeting minutes. It can also be another appointed board member. Managers really should not be the ones to take the meeting minutes because they need to be engaged in the conversations happening, not taking minutes, and also trying to lead the board in the meeting. Some items that should always be included in your meeting minutes, the name of the association, what time the meeting was called to order or was adjourned, who was present at the meeting and who maybe was unable to attend, and then especially any action items or motions that happen within the meeting. Due to the confidentiality, the executive session should be kept separate, and there should be separate meeting minutes kept for executive session that are only shared with board and management. And just as a tip, meeting minutes should really be a summary of what has happened, not a transcript. And you should try and keep it in the order of the agenda. Lastly, are just a couple reminders for board members. For the conduct of meeting, boards should try and utilize a formal process for approvals. Many boards use what's called Robert's Rules of Order for conducting meetings. Typically, your governing documents will outline if there's a certain conduct that you're supposed to use. Robert's Rules of Order, I will not bore you this evening, but is essentially when you do a motion, that motion is seconded, it goes up for discussion and then for up to a vote. It's also important to remember confidentiality. You as board members are given sort of additional information that not all homeowners have access to, mainly lawsuits and collections. It's really important to keep delinquencies confidential because exposing someone might be, or not exposing, but letting other homeowners know about delinquencies could be a violation of fair debt collection practices. And it's also important as board members to be engaged. You want to attend all board meetings. We understand that sometimes things come up, but you want to be in attendance to as many of them as you can. It's important to become prepared, reviewing the pertinent materials and making sure that you're participating in discussions and decisions. And also in this day and age, a lot of things are done via email. So it is important for board members to check their email regularly in order to stay current with what might be happening within the association. So that is all for me regarding board meeting basics. I'm going to turn it over to Irina to go over annual budgeting.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening, everyone. My name is Irina, and I'm the Director of Financial Reporting here with CAMCO. In the following slides, I will discuss budgeting in general and what you as board members should be looking for when you receive your budget drafts. If you have not already received them, you will be receiving a draft shortly for 2022. So what is a budget and why do we need it? A budget is a projection of the money needed by the association to cover its operating expenses and provide adequate reserves for repair and replacements of the property elements. It acts as a guide to assist the board in making the right financial decision. The expense piece of the budget also helps determine the assessments that need to be collected for the budgeted period. The association's current financial position needs to be considered when putting a budget together for a future period. Some of the key items I will discuss are the income statement variances, which could be a result of overspending or underspending, accrued expenses, prepaid expenses, as well as timing. I will go into each into a bit more detail in the following slides. Income statement variances. Income statement variances are derived from overspending or underspending. If you look at the income statement on the slide under operating expenses, utilities, and the electric GL, the period to date, which in this case is July, lets us know that we budgeted to spend $391 and actually spent $362, which creates a small positive variance of about $30. If we move over to the right three columns, we will see the year-to-date information. So in this case, it's January through July. We budgeted $2,741 and spent $2,686 on electric, which is a variance of about $55. In this case, the actual and the budget amounts are fairly close for the utility portion of this. For the future period, we will probably be safe to budget a similar amount unless we received, any sort of notice of an increase from the company. If you move down to the next section, however, maintenance in general and repair expense, we budgeted $416, but only spent $15, which creates a larger variance of $400. And then the year-to-date variance is $3,267. Large variances like this should be investigated. Although there will be an explanation for why the variance is so large in the current period, it needs to be considered when you're thinking about a future budget. Was the variance caused by a one-time expense, or is it something that we anticipate to happen again? If we anticipate it to happen again, regardless if it's positive or a negative variance, we should consider that when deciding on a budgeted number for the future period. So accrued expenses and prepaid expenses. Many times an association will receive a service or a good in one period, but an invoice in a different period. Accrued and prepaid expenses allow us to make sure that the expense is recorded in the correct period. An accrued expense is an expense that has been incurred, but for which an invoice has not been received. Prepaid expenses, on the other hand, are advance payments for goods or services to be received in the future. A good example of accrued expenses are utility bills. If an association used water for the month of June, they're likely not receiving the invoice until sometime in July. By looking at prior months, we can make an educated estimate of what the water expense will be for June and record it as an accrued expense. This way, if you look at the June income statement, it will show a water expense for the month. An example of prepaid expenses that's fairly standard to all associations across the board is insurance. Many times, the full insurance premium is paid in one lump sum or broken out into a few installments. So let's say we pay an insurance premium of $1,200 in December of 2020 that covers the entire year of 2020 and 21. The December financials will show the full $1,200 as a prepaid expense, since it is not anything that we used or needed in December. January financials will have an insurance expense of $100 on the income statement, and that will leave the $1,100 as a prepaid. By the end of the year, the full $1,200 should be expensed and your prepaid balance will be zero. If you look at the example here, you will see this association has a few prepaids that include insurance, contracts, and other. And then if you look down below under the liability section, you will see the accrued expenses on the balance sheet. So this is a sample of a budget draft. If you have not already received this, you will be getting something similar shortly. So I'll just run through it quickly to make sure we understand what we're looking at. So the first column, it's going to have your GL account numbers and titles. Column 1 is the 2021 budget that we had in place that was approved for the year. The following column is the 2021 year-to-date actuals. So in this case, in most cases, it's going to be through June, the first 6 months of the operating year. The following column are going to be the projections for the remainder of the year, so the next 6 months. In this case, July through December. After that is a 2021 projection column. It sums up the actuals for the first 6 months and the projections for the next 6 months, to give you, a projection for the full year and how it relates to the budget. The next column basically is just the variances, again, between the 2021 projections and the 2021 budget. And then the following is the 2022 budget column. So basically, by looking at the 2021 budget and then the 2021 projections, we, make an estimated guess of what the budget should be, or if we received any new contracts, we'll put the actual contract amount in. For those that we do have actual contracts and actual data that we're basing the number on, there's a notes column. It's cut off in the slide because I just wanted everything to fit in so you could see it, but there are notes. So if there is an actual contract, we will know that that's the amount for the contract. And then you have the dollar change and the percentage change from 2021. Okay, and lastly, the timeline. So again, as I said, October 1st, the budget draft was issued to the board. Most of you have received it. If you haven't, you can reach out to your manager or you'll be receiving it shortly. We're hoping to get all the budgets approved by the board by the end of the month. And then November 30th, the budget mailer is sent and the assessments are updated in the portal. That is all I have on budgets, and now we're gonna open up for some questions.
All right, thanks, Irina. We have quite a few questions in the chat. So I'm just going to go over some of these questions, and then myself, Lauren, and Irina will chime in for the answers. And then if anybody else has questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand using the little raise hand feature on Zoom. So we'll just start here in the chat. If a project is very large, is it common for an HOA to get a bank loan? So that's a great question. It depends on a couple of different elements in terms of getting a loan. Certainly the size of the project has something to do with it, but again, it also has to do with how the association has funded in the past. Let's just say, for example, if a project's going to cost $1 million, but you have been funding pretty adequately for the past X amount of years, you might have, you know, $1.5 million and you're able to spare that towards this certain project. Other associations might not have that, and they certainly have to utilize a loan. There might be some circumstances where you're on a very thin threshold and you might opt to use a loan, especially right now because the interest rates are very favorable for those who are looking into getting a loan. So hopefully that helps, and it is pretty common for many associations to do so. What is the fundamental difference between full versus percent threshold reserve funding contribution? Are there pros and cons? Which is used more commonly? So that's a good question. It depends on the reserve study that's being done and which outfit is doing the reserve study itself. There are certain studies that have a couple of different funding projections, one being full funding, and then the others can be what are called like percentage threshold funding. The threshold is just basically a predetermined amount or threshold amount that engineering firm has provided that you should stay above. So then they'll typically do 5% above that or 10% above that. And Lauren, you can feel free to chime in too, but I've seen more commonly associations want to strive to be at that full funding, but oftentimes they're somewhere in between the threshold and the full funding. That's typically what I've found. The full funding is sometimes very hard to achieve for certain associations. So it would require, you know, a special assessment or something like that. So typically it's somewhere in between the two is my answer on that.
No, I'll agree with that as well. You know, full funding is obviously the ideal world, if you will. You know, it's something to strive towards, but not all associations are in that financial position. So it's finding the balance between the threshold and the full funding, and really working, especially if you are underfunded, you know, doing a plan to get to the point where you need to be over the next few years. And I will say, as Julia plugged earlier, we do have a reserve study specialist coming in December, and that would be a great question to ask Andy from ONS. I'm sure he would love to discuss that in a little more detail than we can.
Yeah, we also got a question on, should minimum painting requirements be a reserve common element? So just to clarify, so typically I just had this discussion earlier. So anything that involves painting is typically not going to be considered a reserve expense. Now, whether or not as a part of your association that might be a part of your common element to paint or not, I'm not sure. That would be specific to your association, but generally anything that involves painting is not considered a reserve expense because the IRS doesn't classify it that way, and typically it's not included within your reserve studies, anything that has to do with painting.
Julie, could I interject on this piece right here?
Sure, go ahead.
I'm wondering if there is a basic formula for the amount that a reserve in a building would have. Could it be based on the number of units in the building, the age of the building, the 3-year, 5-year plan? I mean, what's a baseline that a person should have? I mean, we're a gold star building where I am, but there should be some sort of formula.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not an overall formula for every association, because kind of what we went over, every association is different in terms of what you're responsible for, how it's been maintained in the past, and what you funded in the past. You know, you could have items that are generally newer, but also, you know, you may have not been funding much at all in the past, so you might require additional funding now. So it all depends on your specific association, and that's why the reserve study is, you know, more crucial in at least initially determining that amount. Okay. All right, and then we had, this is a good segue with that particular question. We had a question on, do most HOAs use the reserve study to produce their own specific capital plan to be shared with homeowners? So that's a good question. And a lot of times we will generally help to plan out. So like we discussed, where the reserve study might project a certain amount, you might be coming up on, you know, doing that actual project, you might start to get proposals. You might find that it is a little bit more than they had projected or a little bit less than they had projected. You might find that you don't need to replace all the street lights next year. You could hold off on that for 4 years. So there are boards that base off of the reserve study, but you can sort of tweak those numbers based on sort of how the projects pan out or when you actually determine that they do need to be replaced. And I think that if it is in line with the reserve study overall, and you're just basically changing the year based on information you've received from professional resources like contractors or engineers, I think that it is okay to circulate that to the homeowners as well, as long as you have you know, factual data to back it up. And a reserve provider should have what training, qualifications, or certifications? So CAI, our Community Associations Institute, has the reserve specialist
Designation.
I was going to say acclamation, designation. So that's one portion, but typically it's also going to have some sort of engineering firm or engineer background, whether it be civil engineer or structural engineer. There's usually that engineering qualification with the specific company. Many of the engineering firms that we work with, like Lauren was saying, ONS Engineering, who's doing the presentation in December. We also had DW Smith, or PSNS as they're named as well. They did a presentation for us earlier this year. They also do them as well. And there are also certain firms who do specific reserves only. They don't do any other types of engineering. And all right, we had a question on the standard fee for reserve studies. That depends on a couple of different factors. And I'm sorry if you hear my dog barking. So it depends on if that firm has done a study in the past for you. So typically if you're getting an update done, it's going to be less. And Lauren, feel free to chime in again, but I've seen them generally if you're doing a new study where that firm has not been in your community or you've not had one done, it's generally going to run in the, I would say, $5,000 to $6,000 range. It also depends on how many components are in your association as well. So if there's more for them to look at, it's generally going to cost a little bit more. And then for the updates, it can generally cost anywhere from, I think, $3,500 to $5,000, but don't quote me on any of that.
Yeah, it's really going to vary depending on the size of the association, the amount of elements that are common elements that they need to review. You know, typically you see that a condominium is a little bit more than a homeowners association just because there's more components that go into preparing the reserve study, but certainly it doesn't hurt to get multiple proposals for reserve studies. And typically when you're doing what's called a level 1, which is your first reserve study, that's going to be the more expensive of the studies. And then as you are updating them every 3 to 5 years, you're paying a bit less because you're doing what's called a level 2. That sort of is just an update to what your previous existing reserve study.
Then we had a question on how should regular board meetings minutes mask privilege information, say a vote to fine a member?
So any votes for fines or actionable items involving a specific homeowner or specific homeowners should really be recorded in your executive session minutes. And again, those are approved and posted for board only review. They do not go out to the general association.
We then had a question on, is a suitable, simpler Robert's Rules of Order that the board can use? Do we have a Cliff Notes condensed version of it?
I certainly have a few reference materials, so I can send that to whichever specific board it is looking for. I mean, it's really just important. Robert's Rules of Order can be confusing. I have done this for many a year, and then I won't pretend to be an expert on Robert's Rules of Order. I actually know just the basics. But certainly it's just important that someone is able to make essentially a motion or, clearly dictate what you are either approving or voting on, and then just making sure that everyone's in agreement and approving it.
Then for Irina, is there a single budget report number that indicates how well all the expenses are doing against the budget?
Yeah, so on the budget sheet, one of the columns is a 2021 forecast variance. So it will give you the 2021 numbers versus the budget. You could see it individually for a specific GL or, a section like maintenance or general admin, and then the total at the bottom for the total expenses. So you could see, if you came in above or below the budget. Also on your monthly financials on the income statement, there is a column with the variances that gives you, any variances from the budget for the month to date as well as the year to date information.
Thank you. Then we had a question, what published documents are used to determine the useful life of items in the reserve study? So I think a lot of times what they use, I know specifically if there's a certain project or proposals that we have received for projects or that we have already accomplished for that specific community, for that specific component, we will provide that to the engineer, the reserve specialist for their review and to sort of incorporate within their numbers that they use. But generally they take, so let's just say they're replacing the pavement for asphalt. They'll take the total amount of square yards, and then they have an average per square yard that they will use based on other, local projects or whatever contractor resources they use or whatever other methodology they use. And they'll multiply it by that amount of square yards, or say cluster mailboxes. They will take the general average price of a cluster mailbox with installation and they'll times it by, the 20 that you have in the association. But that's generally included within the report to some degree. Don't forget that some associations use an alternate fiscal year. What is the good way to handle that versus vendor contracts that might be based on a calendar year? So that's a good question. We do have some associations that are fiscal year, and I'll let Irina take that. Actually, go ahead.
So if your association is fiscal year, it doesn't really change for the monthly amount. If you have a contract for 12 months, we just want to make sure that we're expensing 1/12 of that, contract for each month for the association. So, fiscal years, they do overlap, but ultimately, we want to expense the piece that's due that month.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if there's garbled audio. I apologize for that. We had another question. Is it sensible to build up a reserve to cover a very costly project where the association could be holding on to several $million for a decade in order to avoid a one-time large assessment. I think that ultimately the goal is to try to avoid the special assessment when possible. And generally that's, with the reserve study, they plan that out. So a lot of times you will have quite a bit of money if you're, saving up for a particular large project such as repaving or re-roofing, depending on your association. So I think it's usually laid out within the reserve study, and I don't think that it's a bad idea to have that available to avoid future special assessments. Have lines of credit ever been applied for to cushion their reserves, only borrowing if needed, therefore no expense if not needed? So that's a good question. I'll let Lauren and Irina chime in as well, but lines of credit are something that definitely associations can have. But I think generally when you are getting one, you want to have some sort of projects or project in mind when you're doing that. I don't think you would want to do that with no project in mind.
Yeah, I agree with Julia. Typically, you wouldn't pull a line of credit unless you had a project in mind. And then, if you have your reserve study completed and projects in mind, the capital reserve expense should be considered in the budgeting process, and hopefully collected prior to the project happening. And if not, if there's a large project, then probably a loan would be the best alternative.
Since HOAs are nonprofits, can they qualify for and apply for grants designated for nonprofits? If not, are they eligible for low interest loans if needed? Personally, and Lauren, I don't know about your experience, but we've not had any.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, so I mean, this is obviously a question for your CPA firm, but typically in my experience, HOAs and associations are not really treated as nonprofits. You're a special class in the eyes of the government for tax purposes. So there typically are not grants for associations, and the loan rates, there aren't, if you're taking out a loan, it's typically at a business rate, not necessarily at a residential or nonprofit rate.
Thanks, Lauren. We had one more question here in the chat. Since contractors' costs vary with inflation, especially now with material availability and their staffing issues, et cetera, what is your recommendation to the association for budget? Do you see or have you seen a mid-year adjustments to cover these sudden increases? So I'll just say personally, and then Irina and Lauren chime in. We're definitely seeing inflation increases right now, unfortunately, and I think for most of our associations, we're trying to plan for that within 2022's budget, especially. We can't really adjust the budget mid-year once we're currently in it right now. So you might find that you have a bit of an operating deficit at the end of the year, unfortunately, because of some of those elements or because of snow, which we had a lot of this year, unfortunately. So a lot of our associations are going through that right now. But I think definitely for your planning for your 2022 budget, you definitely want to take that into consideration. And our managers will typically reach out to certain providers. If you're not within a contract that doesn't already have a set inflation amount in it, or increase or no increase, whatever the contract may be, for any of those variable expense items, we reach out to the contractors, especially insurance, ask them what we could possibly project for those increases for 2022. All right, and then Audra has her hand up. Audra, did you have a question?
Well, my question was in regards to the lines of credit, and the question, I should have prefaced it by stating that it would be done in order to justify. Okay, let me think about how I'm going to say this in my head. to
That's okay.
justify doing a special assessment over a two-year plan, and saving interest on a relatively large loan project. So that, let's see, by 2023, the reserves dip lower than what we typically like to operate under. So in order to justify that, going ahead with that plan, and saving the interest, would it, in other words, I guess, would it make sense if I recommended that? Because what they were doing was the recommendation was to increase the amount of the loan to compensate for delinquencies in paying. I think they were stating that we could have possibly like 11% of the delinquencies on the special assessments based upon our current, how should you say, people that are in arrears now.
Irina, do you want to touch on that?
I don't know. Do you understand I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I
don't know
think
if it's a question worth asking, because it's so specific, and maybe really not helpful for the group, but
yeah, I think there's a lot, there's a lot of pieces to the question that you're asking. If you would like to email me after the meeting, we could look at your particular, association, and things going on there and see what we could recommend and do some sort of like forecasting, to figure out the best solution there.
okay, thank you.
All right, I think Cynthia has her hand raised.
I do. Thank you so much for the meeting. It's very informative. So I'm kind of looping back to some of the topics that were covered. So I realize that painting is not typically a reserve item, but I gather it's something then you have to add to the operating expense. You have to treat it like you have to put enough money away so that when we're doing the exterior refresh, or painting the trim, the doors, because you're going to refresh the exterior, not just the siding, for example. So is there an item that we should have in our operating, but like our operating accounts for that painting?
Yeah, it depends on the extent of the project. If you're going a little bit more, we'll say, in depth with it, you're doing additional sanding or caulking or something like that with a refresh. It's something that you could possibly consider as a reserve expense. It depends on the specifics of the project, but if not,
yeah, I kind of expect it to be kind of expensive. So let's say when you're refreshing the exterior, siding, shutters and everything, downspouts, gutters, all together. So you're not going to put the old shutters back. You're going to, put either paint them, replace them. And I expect that the doors and the trim will have to be addressed. We might do a color change, right? So the colors that we did 30 years ago don't even exist anymore, right? So we may be repainting or replacing some of the trim or painting the trim. It's a large, and it's coordinated with the refresh.
Mm-hmm.
But it's painting is part of that.
Yeah, generally the painting portion itself would be an operating expense. Again, if you're doing it within a project like that, it is arguable that it could be a reserve replacement element based on, if you're replacing all of the trim or portions of the trim that are necessary. It will depend on, your manager, and you could discuss it and see once you receive the proposals on it, the specifics of it as well. But just the general painting itself is typically
Not right. Agreed.
Expense.
Okay, so that's one. Thank you. Yeah, because this is more project based, so I do think there's a value in keeping it with the reserve along with all the other items that would be part of an exterior refresh. So the second one, I know when we're talking about the reserve study, and so I just more of, I guess, a suggestion that I think we're taking the approach that every 5 years we're going to do, have a professional come in and update the reserve study. But every year, the board should be updating the spreadsheet version of this to reflect real time. You know, we replace so many polls and kind of take it out of the future column and move it to the, you know, and adjust the assumptions. Because as you stated, they were long-term projections. And so we're in that position now that, oh, you know, 30 years, the vinyl's going to last. Well, we're looking at it. It's not going to last 30 years. So I don't need to wait 5 years to have a professional move the numbers up. Right. So it's kind of a suggestion if the board has that option to actually revise that, right?
Definitely, yeah. We always recommend that the basically the capital budget, which would be sort of intertwined with what we're discussing with the reserve study, be reviewed, you know, by the board or with the manager every year, kind of when you're planning your operating budget too. You kind of want to take a look at your capital expenses for the next year, see if you have any planned projects, see what you completed over the last year. So I agree, that is something that should be ongoing by the board.
It's a living, dynamic document as opposed to a static, and we'll wait 5 years from now. Yeah, I agree with that.
Correct.
And the last third item I have is I'm in a situation where some homeowners want to see proof that another homeowner who committed a violation was in fact fined. And so I know that I can't, name names, like so-and-so homeowner was. And so I don't know how to provide assurances, right, that the board is in fact taking an even-handed approach, right, for their members, and not just some, get fines and not others. So when it's not visible, they think that there's favorites, I guess from, we're playing favoritism or folks are not getting fined. Have you saw anything where you just kind of say, no name, a homeowner was fined for, let's say, for breaking such and such a rule, another homeowner, where you don't, it's anonymous?
So that's a good question. So I will say, number one, that's like, and for all of the managers that are out there, we constantly get that. So anytime anyone receives a violation, they're going to take it negatively, no matter how it's worded, what you put in there. That homeowner is always going to take it negatively. And then usually, typically, second instinct is to immediately point the finger at every other violation that they see similar within the community and see, ask about what other homeowners are doing. We cannot give them that information. The board should not be giving them that information on other homeowners. Now, generally putting that within your minutes, I don't know, Lauren, what your answer would be. I guess you could, because you're not putting the specific unit, but I don't see what value it has to the.
Yeah, I mean, that's getting like pretty granular when it comes to your meeting minutes. That's almost crossing over into the transcript area as opposed to just a summary. What I can say is, if you can point to the financials and say, you can see that there's fine income that's happening within the association. I'm sure, knowing the type of people who ask for this, they probably are not going to be satisfied by that response. Right. But certainly, you can point to the financial showing that there is fine income coming into the association, and that the applicable fees are being charged to homeowners who are in violation of
it's
policy.
A tough spot. They're really looking for there to be, it's equitable, right? Everyone is being treated in the same way. And I don't know that I can really solve that problem without, disclosing personal information, which we're not entitled to do, right? So right. I don't know really how to address that, but, I guess it's, I'm getting fined as everyone else getting fined for the same infractions and things of that nature. But, okay, I just wondered if there was any, you know, suggestions of how to, you know, assure folks that, you know, we are, you know, trying to treat everyone equally. And any way to show, you know, proof of that.
Yeah, you can also just say there were many other violations sent out. You can just keep it very general like that if you're really pressed. But like Lauren said, you can also, if they want proof, they can see the financial section, but that's about it.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, we've reached a little past 7 this evening, so we're going to have to wrap up our session, but we really appreciate everybody joining us. And again, we have our next 2 upcoming board roundtables. Again, for more questions with a specific professional or engineer in the field doing reserve studies, please join us on December 6th with ONS Engineering. Thank you so much.